Hi everyone, welcome. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something calm, something quiet, something that will gently carry you off to sleep, while filling your mind with something interesting and soft. Tonight, we're going to talk about bees. Specifically, we're going to talk about how bees build their hives, how they find a place to live, how they make the wax, how they shape it, how they fill it, how the whole community works together, slowly, over weeks and months, to create one of the most remarkable structures in the natural world. It's a long story, a slow story, and that's exactly the kind of story we want tonight. So find a comfortable position, let your body settle, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow just a little. There's nowhere to be right now, nothing to do. You can simply listen, and let the world of bees quietly fill your thoughts. We'll begin at the very beginning, before there's a hive at all, before there's even a place for one. We'll begin with a single bee, in a tree, on a warm afternoon, somewhere in the world. Before we can understand how bees build a hive, it helps to understand what a bee colony actually is. A colony of honeybees is not simply a group of insects that happen to live together. It's something closer to a single living organism. Think of it this way: the individual bee, on her own, cannot survive for long. She cannot regulate her own temperature effectively. She cannot reproduce. She cannot gather enough food by herself. She cannot protect herself from many of the threats that exist in the world. But together, as a colony of perhaps 30,000, or 50,000, or even 80,000 bees, they can do all of those things. They can maintain a precise internal temperature. They can reproduce. They can gather food efficiently. They can defend their home. Scientists sometimes refer to this as a superorganism. The colony behaves like one large organism, rather than many small separate ones. The individual bee is more like a cell in a body than a creature living its own independent life. And just as a body has different kinds of cells that do different things, a colony has different kinds of bees that do different things. There is the queen. There is usually only one queen in a healthy colony. She is the only bee who lays fertilized eggs. She can live for several years, quite a long time for an insect. Her main purpose, from a biological standpoint, is reproduction. She may lay up to 2,000 eggs in a single day, during peak season. Then there are the workers. The workers are all female. They make up the vast majority of the colony, tens of thousands of them. And as they age, they take on different jobs. When they are young, they work inside the hive. When they are older, they go out to gather food. And then there are the drones. The drones are male bees. Their one biological purpose is to mate with a queen, not the queen of their own colony, but a queen from a different colony. They don't gather food. They don't make wax. They don't defend the hive. They simply wait. And on warm afternoons, they fly out to areas called drone congregation areas, where they wait for a virgin queen to appear. At the end of summer, when food becomes scarce, the worker bees push the drones out of the hive. The drones cannot survive the winter. But by then, the queens of new colonies have been mated, and the cycle continues. This is the basic shape of a honeybee colony, and it's helpful to hold this picture in your mind as we talk about how these communities come to build their homes. Because the building of a hive is not the work of one bee, it is the work of the whole colony. Together, each bee playing her small part in a process that has been refined over millions of years. A new hive usually begins with a swarm. Swarming is one of the most ancient and fascinating events in the life of a bee colony. It is the way bee colonies reproduce, not as individuals, but as whole communities. When a colony grows large enough, and when conditions are right, the old queen and about half of the worker bees leave the hive together. They pour out of the entrance, in a great dark cloud, buzzing loudly, filling the air around the hive. If you've ever witnessed a swarm, you may know how surprising it can be. A swarm of bees can look almost like a moving storm cloud. At close range, thousands of bees, swirling together in the air. But here is something calming to know. A swarm of bees is, in most circumstances, very gentle. The bees in a swarm have no hive to defend. They have no honey to protect. They are simply traveling. And bees that are simply traveling tend to be very peaceful. The swarm flies, together, to a temporary resting place. Often, it's a tree branch, or the side of a building, or a fence post. The bees cluster together, in a dense ball, with the queen somewhere near the center, warm and protected. And there they wait. This waiting period can last for a few hours, or it can last for a few days. During this time, something remarkable happens inside the cluster. Small groups of bees, perhaps a few hundred of them, leave the resting cluster and go out to search for a new home. These bees are called scout bees. The scout bees spread out in all directions, sometimes flying a mile or more from the resting swarm. They are looking for something specific, a cavity, a hollow space in a tree, or in a rock wall, or in the eaves of an old building. Somewhere sheltered from the wind and rain, somewhere dry. And the bees are not simply looking for any hollow space. They are evaluating these spaces against a surprisingly precise set of criteria. The research of Thomas Seeley, a biologist at Cornell University, has given us a beautiful picture of what scout bees look for. Seeley and his colleagues spent many years observing swarms in the forest near his home in Ithaca, New York, and he documented the scouts' behavior in great detail. What does a good bee home look like? The research suggests that bees prefer a cavity of roughly 40 liters in volume. Not too small. A space too small would not accommodate a full colony and all of its honey. Not too large. A space too large would be difficult to heat through the winter. They also prefer an entrance that faces to the south or southeast in the northern hemisphere. This means the entrance gets the morning sun, which helps warm the hive. In the early hours of the day, they prefer a small entrance, just large enough for bees to pass through. A small entrance is easier to defend against predators. It is also easier to seal with propolis, a sticky resin the bees collect from trees. When cold weather comes, they prefer the entrance to be near the bottom of the cavity rather than the top. This is related to how the bees will organize their home. Honey goes at the top, and the entrance near the bottom allows for good airflow. A scout bee enters a promising cavity and explores it carefully. She walks across the interior surfaces. She measures the size of the space by walking back and forth, almost like a small surveyor, mapping a room. She notices the smell of the space. She notices whether it has been used before, and whether there are any signs of previous occupants. Then she returns to the swarm. And here is where something truly remarkable happens. Something that scientists have studied and marveled at for many years. When a scout bee returns to the cluster with information about a good potential home, she performs a waggle dance. You may have heard of the waggle dance. It's one of the most famous behaviors in all of animal science. Carl von Frisch, an Austrian zoologist, won the Nobel Prize in 1973, partly for his work on decoding the meaning of the waggle dance. Let's talk about the waggle dance for a moment. Not in an excited way, just slowly and gently, because it is a truly beautiful thing to understand. The waggle dance is a form of communication. Through movement, a bee can tell her sisters where to find something, a food source, or a potential home. She can convey direction, she can convey distance, and she can convey quality, how good the thing is. Here is how it works. The bee moves in a specific pattern, on the surface of the cluster, or on the surface of the honeycomb inside a hive. She walks in a straight line, wagging her abdomen from side to side. Then she circles back around to the start. Then she walks the line again, wagging. Then she circles back around. The other way. The pattern, viewed from above, looks a little like a figure eight. The direction of the straight, waggling part of the dance communicates the direction of the target relative to the sun. If the waggle run points straight up, the target is in the direction of the sun. If it points at an angle, the target is at that angle from the sun's direction. The duration of the waggle run communicates distance. A longer waggle run means the target is farther away. The bees have calibrated this remarkably precisely. A waggle run of about 1 second corresponds to a distance of roughly 1 kilometer. And the enthusiasm of the dance, how vigorously the bee waggles, how many times she repeats the dance circuit, communicates quality. A bee that has found an exceptional potential home dances with more energy and repeats her dance more times than a bee that has found a merely acceptable site. Other bees crowd around the dancing scout bee and follow her movements carefully. They touch her with their antennae. They seem to read every detail of her dance, and then some of them fly out to inspect the site she has indicated. If they also find the site impressive, they return and add their own dancing to hers, reinforcing the message. If the site is not as good as another site being advertised by another dancer, they dance less enthusiastically. Gradually, over hours, or even days, the swarm reaches a consensus. One site receives more and more dances. More and more scouts endorse it. Until, at some threshold of agreement, the whole swarm takes flight and moves to the chosen location. This process is called democratic decision-making. By some researchers, the swarm doesn't vote exactly, but through a process of advertisement, inspection, and increasing endorsement, they arrive at a collective decision. And the decision they make is usually a very good one. Thomas Seeley has described this process in his book, Honeybee Democracy, and it is one of those scientific accounts that makes you sit quietly and simply feel a kind of soft wonder at the natural world that these small creatures, without any individual understanding of the whole process, can collectively evaluate many options and settle on the best one. When the swarm finally reaches its chosen site, the bees pour into the opening. Imagine it, a dark stream of bees flowing into a hollow tree, like water flowing into a pool. One bee, then another, then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Inside the hollow, it is dark and warm from all those bodies, and the bees are clustered together as they were on the outside, keeping each other warm. They have brought almost nothing with them. No wax, no honeycomb, no honey, well, a small amount before a swarm leaves the hive. The bees fill their honey stomachs with honey from the old hive. This is their supply for the days ahead. Each bee carries as much as she can. It's a little like packing a bag before a long journey, except the bag is inside their body. Now the work begins. The bees need to build. They need to create, from almost nothing, a home that will sustain tens of thousands of individuals through the seasons ahead. And the first material they need is wax. Beeswax is one of the most remarkable materials in the natural world, and it comes entirely from within the bodies of the bees themselves. On the underside of a worker bee's abdomen, there are 8 small glands, for on each side. These are the wax glands. When conditions are right, when the bee is young enough, when she has consumed enough honey, when the temperature inside the cluster is warm enough, these glands begin to secrete beeswax. The wax appears as thin, translucent flakes on the surface of the bee's abdomen. Each flake is very small, about the size of a pinhead, or a little larger. To produce wax, bees consume honey. This is an important point. Making wax is expensive. From an energy standpoint, it is estimated that bees must consume roughly 6 to 8 kilograms of honey to produce a single kilogram of wax. The exact ratio varies depending on conditions, but the basic principle holds. Wax production requires a significant investment of resources. This is one reason why bees are so economical in their use of wax. They don't waste it. Every cell of honeycomb is made to precise dimensions, using as little wax as possible, while still maintaining strength. A bee with wax flakes on her abdomen uses her legs to scrape the flakes off. She holds the flake in her mandibles, her mouth parts, and chews it. The chewing softens and warms the wax, making it pliable. It also mixes the wax with other secretions from glands in her head, which affects the wax's final properties. The softened wax is then pressed and shaped into place on the growing comb. There is something meditative about imagining this process. Hundreds of bees, each with tiny flakes of wax, appearing on their bodies, each bee carefully removing the flakes, chewing them, pressing them gently into place. Bit by bit, flake by flake, cell by cell, the comb grows. It is not a fast process. Building a full comb takes time. But the bees are patient, or perhaps patient is not quite the right word. Because bees don't have patience the way we mean it. They simply do what they do, without hurrying or worrying. Each bee does her small part, and the whole emerges slowly from the sum of all those small parts. When we picture a honeycomb, we picture hexagons, six-sided cells, arranged in a perfect pattern, each cell fitting perfectly against its neighbors. This is one of the most recognizable patterns in nature, and it raises a natural question. Why hexagons? Let's think about it gently. Imagine you want to divide a flat surface into small containers, cells, that together cover the entire surface, without any gaps or wasted space. What shapes could you use? Triangles work. You can tile a surface perfectly with triangles. Squares work too. You can tile a surface with squares, with no gaps. And hexagons work. Those are the only regular shapes that tile a plane perfectly. Triangle, square, hexagon. Now, if you want each cell to hold as much volume as possible, relative to the amount of wall material used, if you want to be efficient with your material, which shape do you choose? The hexagon wins. Among the three shapes that tile a plane, the hexagon requires the least perimeter to enclose a given area. Or put another way, for a given amount of wall material, a hexagonal cell can hold more than a triangular or square cell. This is sometimes called the honeycomb conjecture, and it was actually a formal mathematical problem. For a long time, mathematicians had suspected for centuries that hexagons were optimal in this way, but a rigorous proof wasn't published until 1999, when Thomas Hales, an American mathematician, provided one. The bees, of course, don't know any of this. They haven't proven the honeycomb conjecture. They don't think about geometry. But over millions of years of evolution, natural selection has favored the hexagonal arrangement because colonies that built hexagonal cells used less wax and stored more honey, and those colonies were more successful. It's a quiet kind of wisdom, not the wisdom of understanding, but the wisdom of deep time. The cells are not quite flat, either. They are tilted very slightly, about 13 degrees upward from horizontal. This means that the liquid honey inside the cells doesn't run out as easily. The angle is small, but it is consistent and precise, repeated across all the cells in the comb. And the cells are arranged back to back, in two layers. Each cell on one face of the comb interlocks with cells on the other face, fitting together like the fingers of two clasped hands, with the closed ends of the cells on one side, fitting into the spaces between the closed ends on the other. This arrangement adds strength to the structure. How do the bees actually build the hexagonal cells? How do they make them so precise? This question has fascinated scientists for a long time. When you look at a comb, the regularity is striking. Each cell is almost exactly the same size as its neighbors. The walls are thin, only about 0.073 millimeters thick on average. And yet, they are strong enough to hold honey, developing brood, and the weight of bees walking across them. For a long time, people assumed that bees were measuring their work very carefully, using their bodies as rulers, perhaps, or relying on some kind of blueprint in their brains. But more recent research has suggested a simpler and more beautiful explanation. The key may be heat. Bees maintain a warm temperature inside the hive. We'll talk more about that later. When a bee presses a piece of wax into place, the wax is warm from being chewed and handled. Warm wax is soft and flows slightly, like a very slow liquid. When multiple bees are working on neighboring cells, each one pushing warm wax from her own cell, the wax flows gently into the space between cells and the forces of surface tension, the same forces that make a soap bubble round, may help to pull the wax into the most efficient shape. In other words, the hexagons may not be carefully measured and constructed by individual bees, acting as precise craftspeople. Instead, the hexagonal shape may emerge from the physics of warm wax, from the natural tendency of materials under certain conditions to organize themselves into efficient shapes. This idea that complex, beautiful structures can emerge from simple physical processes without any overall plan is one of the recurring themes of science, and it is a gently humbling one. That said, the bees clearly are doing skilled work. They are not simply melting wax and watching it form shapes. They are pressing, shaping, smoothing. Different bees work on different parts of the growing comb. Simultaneously, they smooth and thin the walls. They correct imperfections. The whole process is somewhere between deliberate construction and emergent physics. As with so many things in the natural world, it resists simple categorization. Let's step back now and think about the hive as a whole. Inside that hollow tree, or inside a beekeeper's wooden hive box, the bees will build a series of parallel combs. These combs hang down from the top of the cavity, one after another, like the pages of a book. The space between adjacent combs is remarkably consistent. It's called bee space, and it is approximately 6 to 9 millimeters wide. This gap is just wide enough for a bee to pass through and work comfortably, but not so wide that the bees feel compelled to fill it with additional comb. Bee space was discovered, or rather, formally recognized, by a beekeeper named Lorenzo Langstroth. In the 19th century, Langstroth was an American minister and beekeeper who suffered from depression and found solace in working with his bees. He noticed that when the space between combs was too narrow, the bees filled it with propolis, the sticky plant resin they use as a sealant and glue. When the space was too wide, they filled it with additional comb. But when the space was just right, that 6 to 9 millimeter range, the bees left it open as a natural corridor. This discovery led Langstroth to design the modern beehive with removable frames, spaced at bee space apart. This design revolutionized beekeeping and is still the standard today. Within the hive, the combs serve different functions, and the bees organize these functions in a remarkably consistent way. The lowest portion of the comb and the portions in the center of the hive are typically used for brood, the developing eggs, larvae, and pupae. This is the nursery. The honey is stored above and to the outside of the brood area. This arrangement means The honey is on the periphery, and the developing young are in the warm, central core of the hive. The honey acts somewhat like insulation, surrounding and protecting the brood. Pollen, which the bees collect from flowers and use as a protein source to feed their young, is usually stored in cells near the brood, convenient to where it will be used. This spatial organization is not random. Studies have shown that worker bees actively move resources and developing brood to maintain this arrangement. If a researcher moves a comb, the bees will work to restore the proper order. Over time, the organization of the hive reflects the organization of the colony's needs. It is, in a quiet way, a kind of architecture that encodes the colony's priorities. Let's talk about propolis for a while. Propolis is a material that bees collect from plants. Specifically, they collect resins, sticky substances that many plants produce to protect themselves from insects, fungi, and other threats. The bees fly to trees, often poplars, birches, conifers, or horse chestnuts, and use their mandibles to scrape resin from buds, bark, and damaged areas. They pack the resin into their pollen baskets, small structures, on their hind legs, and carry it back to the hive. Inside the hive, other bees help unload the propolis. This can be a slow process because propolis is very sticky and doesn't unload easily. Sometimes several bees work together to pull the propolis free. Once in the hive, the propolis is mixed with a small amount of wax and used in various ways. The bees use propolis to fill gaps and cracks in the hive. They seal up openings that might let in cold air or predators. They coat the interior walls of the hive with a thin layer of propolis, like varnish on a wooden floor. They use it to secure combs to the walls of the cavity and to reinforce the attachment points of the comb. But propolis is not just a structural material. It is also, and this is one of the more remarkable facts about bees, a powerful antimicrobial substance. The resins that plants produce often have antimicrobial properties. They protect the plant from bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens. When bees collect these resins and apply them throughout the hive, they are, in effect, giving their home a kind of antibacterial coating. Studies have found that the air inside propolis-lined hives has lower levels of bacteria than the air in hives where the propolis has been removed. The bee's immune function, measured by the activity of certain genes involved in immunity, is also lower in propolis-lined hives. This suggests that the propolis does some of the work of fighting pathogens, so the bees' own immune systems don't have to work as hard. The propolis lining also seems to reduce the growth of mold and fungi, which can be a threat in the warm, humid environment of a hive. And when something enters the hive that is too large for the bees to remove, a mouse that has found its way in and died, for example, the bees will encapsulate it in propolis, mummifying it and preventing it from decomposing and spreading bacteria through the hive. This is a behavior that, if you think about it too long, could seem unsettling, but in the context of the hive's biology, it makes complete sense. The bees cannot carry a dead mouse out of the hive, but they can seal it and make it harmless. Propolis has been used by humans for thousands of years as well. Ancient Egyptians used it in the mummification process. Greek and Roman physicians used it as a medicine. In more recent times, propolis extracts have been studied for their potential antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. In human medicine, the bees understood something about these plant resins long before we did. Let's return to the cells themselves. We talked about hexagons and how they're built. Now let's think about what goes inside them. A honeybee hive has cells that serve several different purposes, and the sizes of the cells are not all the same. The most common cells are worker cells. These are the small hexagonal cells that make up the majority of the comb. They are used to store honey, to store pollen, and to raise worker bees. A worker bee begins its life as an egg laid at the bottom of one of these cells. Drone cells are somewhat larger. The male bees, the drones, are bigger than worker bees, and they need larger cells to develop in. A beekeeper can tell the difference between worker and drone comb by looking at the cell size. Drone cells are visibly wider than there are queen cells. Queen cells are unlike any other cell in the hive. They are not part of the regular grid of hexagons. They are large, vertical, peanut-shaped structures, usually built at the edges or bottom of a comb. A queen cell can be an inch or more long, much larger than any other cell. In the hive, queen cells are built when the colony needs a new queen. This happens when the colony is preparing to swarm, when the current queen is aging or performing poorly, or when the current queen has died. There are also cells called queen cups. These are small, bowl-shaped structures that are built before they are needed. They are a kind of preparation. The bees build the beginnings of queen cells in advance, ready to be completed if and when a new queen is needed. A queen cup is about the size of an acorn. If you were to look inside a hive with an experienced beekeeper, she might point them out to you. Small, round depressions, scattered at the edges of the comb, waiting. Each cell is built with a purpose. The bees build the cells they need, and not much more. When the population grows, they build more cells. When the colony shrinks over winter, they don't use many cells. The hive expands and contracts with the needs of its inhabitants. It is a very practical kind of architecture, built not for aesthetics, though it happens to be beautiful, but purely for function. One of the most interesting things about a bee colony is how the work is divided. We said earlier that worker bees take on different jobs as they age. Let's look at this more carefully. It's a gentle progression from the first days of a bee's life to the last. A worker bee emerges from her cell after about 21 days of development. She is not yet ready to fly. Her wings are soft. Her body is not fully hardened. She needs a day or two to get ready for the world. In the first few days of her adult life, she works near the center of the hive. Her first job is cell cleaning. She goes through the cells, removing debris, polishing the walls with her tongue. A cell must be clean before the queen will lay an egg in it, and it must be clean before honey or pollen is stored in it. The cleaning is careful and thorough. After a few days of cleaning, the young bee's hypopharyngeal glands in her head, begin to develop. These glands produce a substance called brood food, or royal jelly. It's a rich, milky secretion that is fed to developing larvae. During this phase, roughly days 6 through 12 of her adult life, she works as a nurse bee. She visits cells containing young larvae and deposits food. She tends to the brood with careful attention, checking each cell repeatedly. Throughout the day, this is one of the most labor-intensive phases of a worker bee's life. The larvae are hungry, and there are many of them, and they need to be fed many times each day. Around day 12 or 13, the worker bee's wax glands begin to mature. She can now produce the wax flakes we talked about earlier. During this phase, she may contribute to comb construction, adding her small pieces of wax to the growing structure. She may also take on other hive tasks. During this period, receiving nectar from forager bees and beginning to process it, taking pollen from incoming foragers and packing it into cells, fanning her wings to help ventilate the hive, taking short orientation flights near the entrance to begin to learn where the hive is located, and then, somewhere around her third week of adult life, around day 18 to 21, the worker bee becomes a guard. She stands at the hive entrance, antennae alert, checking incoming bees. Each bee that lands at the entrance has a particular chemical scent, a combination of compounds that identifies her as belonging to this colony. The guard bees check this scent, and they allow colony members through and reject strangers. If a foreign bee tries to enter, perhaps a bee from another colony that has found the hive's honey stores attractive, the guard bees will block her, wrestle with her, and ultimately drive her away. If an intruder is particularly persistent, the guards may sting. The sting of a honeybee is, of course, fatal to the bee herself. A worker bee's stinger has barbs on it, and when she stings a mammal whose skin is elastic enough to trap the barbed stinger, she cannot pull the stinger free. She tears herself away from it, and the separation is fatal. This is why, when a bee stings, it means she has decided that defending the hive is more important than her own survival. It is not aggression in the way we might imagine aggression. It is something closer to sacrifice. Finally, after about 3 weeks of indoor work, the bee transitions to the final phase of her adult life, foraging. She goes outside. She learns to navigate. She visits flowers. She brings back nectar, pollen, water, and propolis. A forager bee lives hard and dies relatively quickly. The work of flying, sometimes miles each day, landing on hundreds of flowers, wears out her body. Her wings fray. After a few weeks of foraging, she simply doesn't return to the hive one day. The entire adult life of a worker bee during the busy summer season is about 6 weeks. Let's follow a forager bee for a while. Let's imagine her morning. The sun has risen. The temperature near the hive entrance begins to warm. The forager bee stirs from wherever she spent the night, perhaps on the surface of the comb, or clustered with other bees. Near the entrance, she makes her way to the entrance and steps out into the light. She takes off. Her wings beat approximately 200 times per second, producing that familiar soft hum that bees are known for. She flies, navigating by the position of the sun, by landmarks she has memorized during her orientation flights, by the polarized patterns of light in the sky that her eyes can detect, even on cloudy days. She may have information from a waggle dance she observed inside the hive, a direction, an approximate distance, the scent of the flowers, another bee described. She follows these cues, adjusting as she goes. When she finds a flower, she lands. Her body is designed for this moment. She has a long, tube-like tongue, a proboscis, that she extends into the flower to reach the nectar. She has 2 honey stomachs, one for her own use, and one, the crop, or honey stomach, for storing nectar to carry back to the hive. She fills her crop with nectar. This takes time. One bee might visit dozens or even hundreds of flowers to fill her crop completely. While she is collecting nectar, she is also, and this is the part that the flowers are counting on, picking up pollen. The pollen sticks to her body hair. Honeybees have branched, plumose body hair, which is particularly good at trapping pollen grains. Some of this pollen rubs off on the next flower she visits, pollinating it. She also actively collects pollen. For the hive, she uses her legs to comb pollen from her body, pack it into structures on her hind legs, called corbiculae, or pollen baskets, and carry it back to the hive. When she returns to the hive, she's met by younger bees, receivers. She passes her nectar to them through a process called trophallaxis, mouth-to-mouth transfer. The younger bee takes the nectar into her own crop, begins processing it, and the forager goes out again. Nectar, at this point, is still a long way from honey. It is a watery sugar solution. Honey is a concentrated, thick, very low moisture product. Turning nectar into honey requires removing most of its water. The bees do this through a combination of enzymatic processing and evaporation. The enzymes, including invertase and glucose oxidase, are added by the bees. As they pass the nectar back and forth, they break down the complex sugars in nectar into simpler sugars. They also produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, which gives honey its mild antibacterial properties. And evaporation is achieved by the bees, spreading the nectar in thin layers across many cells, and by fanning their wings to create airflow through the hive. This airflow evaporates water from the nectar, gradually concentrating it. When the honey has reached a water content of about 17 to 20%, the bees cap it. They cover the cell with a thin layer of beeswax, sealing the honey inside. Capped honey can be stored for extraordinarily long time, years, decades, perhaps indefinitely, under the right conditions. Archaeologists have found honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that was still edible after more than 3,000 years. One of the most remarkable things about a honeybee colony is how precisely it regulates the temperature inside the hive. The developing brood, the eggs, larvae, and pupae in their cells need to be kept at a very specific temperature, approximately 35 degrees Celsius, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. This is, notably, very close to human body temperature, and the bees maintain it with a precision that would impress an engineer. If the hive gets too cold, the bees cluster together and shiver their flight muscles to generate heat. They don't actually move their wings. They contract and relax their flight muscles rapidly without moving the wings themselves, which generates heat. Much like shivering generates heat in mammals, the bees in the center of the cluster are warmer. The bees on the outside are cooler, acting as insulation. The cluster is not static. Bees move from the outside inward and from the inside outward, so no individual bee stays too cold for too long. If the hive gets too warm, the bees have ways of cooling it down. They fan their wings. Groups of bees position themselves near the entrance and fan, creating a directed airflow. Through the hive, hot air moves out, fresh air moves in. They also bring water. On very hot days, you may see bees collecting water from puddles, bird baths, or streams. They carry the water back to the hive and spread it in thin films over the comb. As the water evaporates, it cools the surrounding air. The fanning bees enhance this evaporative cooling. This is, functionally, the same principle as evaporative cooling, or swamp coolers, as they're sometimes called. The bees discovered this principle long before humans did. The precision of temperature regulation in a healthy hive is genuinely impressive. The brood area can be maintained within about half a degree of 35 Celsius. Even when outside temperatures fluctuate widely, individual bees also thermoregulate in more direct ways. A bee can press her warm thorax directly against the capping of a cell containing a developing bee, like a small heating pad, and transfer heat to the cell. She holds this position for a few minutes, then moves on. Other bees do the same. Together, they keep the brood evenly warm. Temperature is not the only environmental factor. The bees manage. They also manage humidity. The interior of a beehive needs to be moderately humid, dry enough to cure honey, but not so dry that the developing brood suffers. The bees regulate this through ventilation. Some bees stand at the hive entrance and fan, as we mentioned, creating airflow. The direction of fanning can be adjusted. Bees fanning inward bring fresh air in. Bees fanning outward push air out. The colony coordinates the fanning behavior to achieve the desired airflow pattern. Inside the hive, deeper ventilation occurs. As bees move around, their bodies stir the air. The heat from the brood cluster creates convection currents. The hive is not a sealed, stagnant environment. It is continuously refreshed by the activity of its inhabitants. The bees also seal gaps and cracks with propolis, which helps them control where air enters and exits. They can close off some pathways and leave others open, adjusting the airflow as needed. In winter, ventilation is managed very carefully. The bees need some airflow to prevent moisture from building up. The breath of tens of thousands of bees produces a lot of water vapor. If that moisture condenses and drips back onto the cluster, it can be harmful. Cold bees can tolerate cold, but cold, wet bees are in serious trouble. Beekeepers who manage their hives through winter often think carefully about ventilation for exactly this reason. A small entrance at the bottom, a small vent at the top, creating a gentle upward airflow, can help manage moisture without letting in too much cold air. We haven't talked much about the queen yet. In the context of building, the queen's role in the physical construction of the hive is actually very small. She doesn't make wax. She doesn't carry propolis. She doesn't fan the air or guard the entrance. Her primary function is laying eggs, and yet, the queen shapes the hive in an indirect way. Her presence and her condition influence the behavior of the entire colony. The queen produces chemical substances called pheromones. These are chemical signals that bees communicate with. The queen's pheromone blend, sometimes called queen substance, is distributed through the colony. As bees share food and groom each other, it passes from bee to bee. Throughout the whole colony, this chemical signal tells the workers that the queen is present, healthy, and active. It suppresses the workers' own reproductive capabilities, and it influences the workers' behavior in many ways, including their level of industriousness, their readiness to swarm, and their willingness to raise new queens. When a colony loses its queen, when she dies or is removed, the change in pheromone levels is detected within hours. The workers begin to behave differently. Some workers, in a queenless colony, begin to develop their ovaries and lay unfertilized eggs. Though this is generally a colony in distress, more constructively, the workers also begin to build queen cells to raise a new queen. And this is when the hive-building skill of the colony is directed toward those large, peanut-shaped queen cells we talked about earlier. The queen also influences the size of cells. The queen lays eggs in cells based on the cell's size. Worker-sized cells get fertilized eggs that develop into workers. Drone-sized cells get unfertilized eggs that develop into drones. The queen may sense the cell size with her forelegs and adjust her behavior accordingly. And the queen cells, when the colony decides to build them, are monitored carefully by the workers throughout the queen's development inside. They feed the larva inside, regulate the temperature, and defend the cell from threats. We've mentioned royal jelly. Briefly, let's spend a little time on it. Royal jelly is the substance that makes a queen. A queen All bee larvae start out the same. A fertilized egg hatches into a tiny larva. For the first 3 days of larval life, every larva, whether it is destined to become a worker or a queen, is fed royal jelly. This rich, creamy substance is produced by the hypopharyngeal glands of young nurse bees. After those first 3 days, the diet diverges. Worker larvae receive a diet that still includes some royal jelly, but is supplemented with pollen and honey. Queen larvae continue to receive royal jelly, and lots of it. The queen cell is actually provisioned with so much royal jelly that the developing queen larva floats in it. This difference in diet leads to profound differences. In the adult bee, a queen is larger than a worker. Her abdomen is longer to accommodate her well-developed ovaries. She lives much longer, 3 to 5 years, versus 6 weeks. For a summer worker, she can lay fertilized or unfertilized eggs at will. She has no wax glands, no pollen baskets, no hypopharyngeal glands. She has traded many of the worker's specialized tools for the single specialization of reproduction. All of this from the same genetic material, achieved by feeding the larva a different diet. The specific substance in royal jelly, responsible for triggering queen development, has been a subject of scientific interest. In 2011, researchers identified a protein called royal actin as potentially being a key factor. The picture is somewhat more complex than a single substance, and the science is still being refined, but the basic principle holds. Diet during larval development determines adult body plan. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. The same egg, the same DNA, the same potential, fed differently, it becomes something completely different. A being whose whole body, whose whole life, is shaped by what it ate in its first few days of existence. There is something very quiet in that thought. Let's trace the development of a worker bee from egg to adult. It's a story told in weeks, and in the quiet darkness of a wax cell. Day 1. The queen visits a clean cell. She pauses, assesses the cell with her forelegs, then lowers her abdomen into the cell and lays a single egg. The egg is very small, about the size of a poppy seed. It stands upright in the cell, attached to the bottom by one end. Days 1 through 3. The egg stands in the cell. The worker bees check on it, but mostly leave it alone. Inside the egg, cells are dividing, organizing, preparing. On the 3rd day, the egg hatches. A tiny, white larva curls at the bottom of the cell. Days 3 through 6. The larva is fed by nurse bees. It grows rapidly. A bee larva, during the feeding period, increases its weight by about 1,500 times. It sheds its skin, or molts, 5 times during this period. By the end of the 6th day, it nearly fills the cell. Day 9, the nurse bees stop feeding the larva and cap the cell with a layer of wax. The larva is now sealed inside. It straightens out, spinning a thin silk cocoon around itself, and transforms into a pupa. Days 9 through 21. Inside the capped cell, the pupa undergoes metamorphosis. Wings form, compound eyes develop, 6 legs take shape, antennae appear. The body darkens gradually. The adult bee takes form inside its casing. Day 21. The adult worker bee chews her way through the wax capping. She emerges into the light and warmth of the hive. She is small, wet-looking, a little pale. Other bees groom her and feed her. Within a day or 2, she is ready to start her life's work. Worker, 21 days, from egg to adult. Queen, 16 days. Drone, 24 days. These timelines are remarkably consistent. The precision of bee development is one of the things that makes studying them so satisfying. There's a clockwork quality to it, a regularity that feels both biological and almost mathematical. A new colony, starting from a swarm, begins small. They have a hollow space, they have their stored honey, and they have their bodies, which will produce wax. In the first days, after arrival, the bees cluster together and begin to raise the temperature of the cavity. They eat their stored honey. The wax glands of the younger bees become active. The first pieces of comb appear, small, ragged, not yet orderly. The bees build down from the top of the cavity, pressing wax flakes into place, gradually building up the first cells. The queen begins to lay. She lays in the first cells as soon as they are built. This is important. New bees are needed quickly to replace the older foragers who are dying and to bring in food. The colony is in a race against time. It needs to build up its population and its food stores before winter comes. Every day matters. Through spring and summer, the colony grows. More bees emerge from their cells, join the workforce, and build more comb. The hive expands steadily. More combs are added. The brood area grows. The honey stores grow. At the colony's peak, in midsummer, it might house 50,000 or more bees. The hive hums with activity. Foragers come and go constantly. Every bee has a job. The whole structure, comb, propolis, temperature, ventilation, is maintained in a constant state of readiness. But summer doesn't last. As days grow shorter and temperatures begin to cool, the colony shifts its priorities. The queen slows her laying rate. Fewer new bees are raised. The colony stops producing drones. They are an expensive luxury that winter cannot afford. The workers evict the drones from the hive, pushing them out the entrance. Without the colony's food supply to sustain them, the drones don't survive. The cooling nights, the foragers collect as much nectar and pollen as they can, right up until the first frosts. They cap honey over every available cell. They seal the hive with propolis, closing gaps, reducing the entrance opening. And then, winter, the colony forms its winter cluster. Thousands of bees, pressed together in a ball, roughly the size of a soccer ball or a bit larger. They maintain a temperature in the center of the cluster of around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. Not as warm as they kept the brood in summer, but warm enough to survive. They eat honey, slowly, steadily, through the dark months. They consume their stores, moving as a cluster, always toward the honey. If their stores are sufficient, they will survive until spring. If not, they will starve. In spring, the queen begins laying again. The cluster loosens. The colony stirs. The first foragers make tentative flights on warm days, looking for the earliest flowers. And the cycle begins again. The hive is full of chemical signals, pheromones, scents, messages written, not in language, but in chemistry. We've mentioned the queen's pheromones, but the workers also communicate chemically in many ways. One of the most important worker pheromones is the alarm pheromone. When a bee stings, or when a bee detects a serious threat, she releases a chemical compound. The primary component is isoamyl acetate, which smells somewhat like bananas. This compound signals to nearby bees that danger is present. Bees that detect the alarm pheromone become more alert and more likely to sting. If the threat persists, more alarm pheromone is released, and more bees are recruited into defensive behavior. This is why it's often said that if one bee stings you near a hive, others may follow. It's not just behavioral contagion, it's chemical contagion. The first sting releases a scent that tells the other bees that a defense is needed. The Nasanov pheromone is quite different. It is a pleasant, citrus floral scent that bees release to guide other bees to a location. Bees at the entrance of a new nest site release Nasanov pheromone to guide incoming bees to the right place. Bees at a water source release it to guide others to the water. When a swarm is landing, bees that have found a perch release Nasanov pheromone to attract the others. If you've ever seen a group of bees fanning with their abdomens raised at the entrance of a hive, they're probably releasing Nasanov pheromone. It's a welcoming scent, a come here scent. There are also pheromones that regulate the behavior of developing bees inside their cells. Brood pheromones are released by the larvae, and they influence the behavior of the nurse bees. A well-fed larva releases different amounts of certain pheromones than a hungry larva, and the nurse bees respond accordingly. Some brood pheromones suppress the development of ovaries in worker bees. As long as healthy brood is present, workers tend not to develop their own reproductive capabilities. The hive is, in a sense, a chemical conversation that never stops. Constant information flowing through the colony, not in words, but in molecules. The concentration of a compound rises and falls. A behavior is triggered. A response is given. Another compound is released. The conversation continues. It's an invisible language. And for most of human history, we had no idea it existed. We've talked about how forager bees go out to find food. But let's spend some more time on navigation, because the way bees navigate is another one of those things that, when you understand it, produces a quiet sense of wonder. Bees can navigate over distances of several kilometers. They fly out from the hive, find food, and return accurately. They do this day after day in changing light conditions, with wind affecting their flight. How? The sun is the primary compass. A bee's eyes can perceive ultraviolet light, and they can detect the pattern of polarized light in the sky. This polarization pattern is related to the position of the sun, even when the sun itself is obscured by clouds. The polarization pattern in a patch of blue sky can tell the bee where the sun is. This means bees can navigate on partly cloudy days, as long as a patch of sky is visible. But here is an interesting complication. The sun moves across the sky. A bee that leaves the hive at 9 in the morning and returns at 11 will find the sun in a different position. If her navigation simply relied on compass direction to the sun, she would become confused. Bees solve this by compensating for the sun's movement. They have an internal clock, a circadian rhythm, that tells them approximately what time of day it is. They know that the sun moves across the sky at a certain rate, and they adjust their solar compass readings accordingly. This means a bee can leave the hive, take note of her direction relative to the sun, spend time foraging, and return, accounting for the time that has passed and the new position of the sun. Bees also remember landmarks. They memorize the visual landscape near the hive during their orientation flights. Trees, rocks, buildings, the shape of the horizon, all of these become part of the bee's mental map. If familiar landmarks have changed, a tree has fallen, a building has appeared, bees can be confused or take longer to find their way. There's evidence that bees build something like a cognitive map of the area around the hive, not just a route from A to B, but a more flexible, spatial representation that allows them to take novel shortcuts and detours. And when communicating the location of food through the waggle dance, the dancer must translate from her egocentric experience of the flight, the angles, the landmarks she saw, into the abstract language of the dance, which other bees will then translate back into their own flight plan. This translation across bees, from experience to dance to experience again, is a form of communication that humans are only beginning to fully understand. Let's step back and think about the hive from the perspective of architecture. A honeybee hive is a structure built by its inhabitants from materials they produce themselves to specifications they have been refining for millions of years. It is self-healing. Bees repair damage to the comb and reseal cracks with propolis. It is self-extending. The colony builds more comb. As it grows, it is adaptive. The structure changes to reflect the current needs of the colony. In some ways, it resembles the kind of architecture that human designers describe as biomimicry, architecture that takes inspiration from biological solutions. The hexagonal cell is one example that humans have adopted in materials science, aerospace engineering, and product design. Hexagonal structures appear in everything from aircraft components to packing materials to architectural facades, often because of the same efficiency properties that bees evolved to exploit. The evaporative cooling the bees use is another example. Passive cooling through water evaporation and airflow is increasingly being explored in human architecture as an energy-efficient alternative to mechanical air conditioning. But perhaps the most interesting thing about a beehive as architecture is its distributed nature. There is no architect, no central designer, no foreman bee who oversees the whole project and makes sure everything comes together correctly. Instead, each bee responds to her local environment, the temperature around her, the pheromone concentrations she smells, the material she can feel with her antennae, and does what her body and instincts tell her to do in that moment. And from all of those local responses, all of those individual actions, the coherent, beautiful, functional structure of the hive emerges. This kind of order, arising from local interactions, is called self-organization or emergence. It's a phenomenon that appears not just in beehives, but throughout the natural world, in the formation of snowflakes, in the swirling patterns of flocking birds, in the growth of coral reefs, in the development of embryos. And it raises a question that scientists and philosophers have found endlessly interesting. What is the relationship between simple rules and complex outcomes? How can enormous complexity emerge from simple, local behaviors? Where exactly does the order come from? In the beehive, as in many places, the honest answer is that we don't fully know. Yet, we can describe what happens, we can model it, but the deeper question of how biological systems generate this kind of organized complexity remains one of the great, open questions of science. The entrance to the hive is a small but important place. In a natural hollow tree, the entrance is often a narrow gap or hole, perhaps just an inch or two across. The bees frequently reduce this further with propolis, narrowing it to the smallest practical opening. This narrowness is deliberate. A small entrance is easier to defend. The guard bees can inspect every incoming bee without being overwhelmed by the volume. Near the entrance, you'll often see a landing board, or in nature, a natural flat area where forager bees land. Before entering, they clean themselves here. They let the guards inspect them. Sometimes, on very warm days, you'll see bees fanning at the entrance to move air through the hive. The entrance is also where the dead are removed. Bees that die inside the hive are carried out by undertaker bees, workers who specialize in removing debris and dead bodies from the interior and dropped at some distance from the hive entrance. Cleanliness inside the hive is important for disease prevention, and the bees take it seriously. Beekeepers pay close attention to the hive entrance. The activity at the entrance tells you a great deal about what is happening inside. A busy entrance with many bees coming and going, carrying pollen on their hind legs, suggests a healthy, active colony. The queen is laying, the foragers are working, everything is proceeding well. An entrance with little activity, or bees clustering outside in an unusual way, or bees fighting at the entrance, or dead bees piling up. These are signals that something may need attention. A sudden quiet after a period of busy activity might mean the colony has swarmed, or that something has gone wrong. Inside, beekeepers develop a sensitivity to the hive entrance. Over time, the way a parent develops sensitivity to the sounds of a sleeping child, or the way a gardener learns to read the signs of plant health. Small changes mean things. We've mentioned pollen several times. Let's talk about it more fully, because pollen is essential to the life of the hive, and the bee's relationship with it is a beautiful one. Pollen is the protein source of the bee colony. It contains amino acids, lipids, vitamins, and minerals that the bees cannot get from nectar alone. It is especially critical for feeding larvae. Nurse bees need pollen to produce brood food, and larvae need protein to grow. Bees visit flowers, and pollen sticks to their branch body hairs. They comb the pollen into their pollen baskets, which are concave structures on their hind legs, ringed with stiff hairs. They add a tiny bit of nectar to the pollen to help it stick together, forming a neat pellet. A forager bee can carry pollen loads that amount to as much as 30% of her body weight. When she returns to the hive, you can see the pollen clearly, a bright spot of color on each hind leg. The color varies enormously depending on the flower. Bright yellow from dandelions, pale cream from apple blossoms, deep orange from poppies, violet from phacelia, red from roses. If you ever watch the entrance of a hive for a while, the variety of pollen colors coming in is quietly beautiful. Inside the hive, bees unload the pollen into cells near the brood. A bee arriving with a pollen load pushes forward into a cell and scrapes the pollen from her legs using her middle legs. Other bees pack the pollen tightly into the cell with their heads, compressing it into a dense layer. This compressed pollen is called bee bread. It's not just pollen. The bees add honey, secretions, and perhaps microbial cultures to it through fermentation-like processes. The pollen is transformed into bee bread, which is more digestible, more nutritious, and more shelf-stable than raw pollen. Bee bread is the food that nurse bees eat to produce brood food. It is the foundation of the colony's growth. While we're thinking about pollen, let's gently consider the relationship between bees and flowers. It is one of the most consequential relationships In the natural world, bees need flowers for food. Flowers need bees and other pollinators for reproduction. This is a relationship called mutualism. Both parties benefit, and it is so deep and so long-standing that it has shaped the evolution of both. Flowering plants, angiosperms, appeared in the fossil record roughly 140 million years ago. Bees have existed for at least 80 to 100 million years, though the exact timeline of bee evolution is still being refined as new fossils are found over these tens of millions of years. Flowers and bees have evolved together. Flowers have evolved colors, shapes, scents, and nectar compositions that attract bees. Bees have evolved bodies, behaviors, and sensory systems that are exquisitely suited to finding and processing what flowers offer. Many flowers have evolved ultraviolet patterns that are invisible to humans, but visible to bees. These patterns often function like landing guides, lines and shapes that direct the bee toward the center of the flower, where the nectar and pollen are. Some flowers have evolved to be shaped precisely like the body of a specific pollinator, ensuring that pollen is deposited in exactly the right place. Some flowers produce warmth inside their petals, attracting bees seeking warmth. On cool days, some flowers time their opening to coincide with the peak foraging times of their primary pollinators. And bees, for their part, have evolved remarkable sensory capabilities. They can see patterns on flowers that we cannot. They can detect the electric field of a flower, which changes after a bee has recently visited it. This allows them to tell, without landing, whether a flower has recently been depleted of nectar. They can learn the scents, colors, shapes, and locations of rewarding flowers and remember them. They can communicate this information to their colony members. The relationship between bees and flowers is so intertwined that the disappearance of bees would lead to the disappearance of many flowering plants, and vice versa. It is an old partnership, a quiet interdependence, built over geological time. We've been talking mostly about the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, because it is the most widely studied and most familiar. But it's worth noting that bees are an extraordinarily diverse group. There are estimated to be about 20,000 species of bees on Earth. They belong to 7 recognized families, and they are found on every continent except Antarctica. They range in size from tiny sweat bees, a couple of millimeters long, to large carpenter bees. Most bee species do not build hives at all. Most bees are solitary. A female solitary bee digs a burrow, or finds a hollow stem, or carves a cell in wood, and she provisions this cell with pollen and nectar. She lays an egg in it, seals it, and leaves. She may repeat this process many times, but there is no colony, no superorganism, no communal hive. Bumblebees are somewhere in between. They are social, and they form colonies, but their colonies are much smaller, usually fewer than 500 individuals, and they don't survive winter. As a colony, the fertilized queen overwinters alone and starts a new small colony in spring among the truly social, hive-building bees. The honeybees of the genus Apis are the most prominent. There are about 8 recognized species of Apis bees. Some Apis species build open-air nests. The giant honeybee, Apis dorsata, builds a single enormous comb, often several feet across, hanging from the branch of a tall tree. or from the overhanging rock of a cliff, exposed to the elements. These bees form a dense curtain of their own bodies over the comb, protecting it and regulating its temperature with their collective warmth. The dwarf honeybee, Apis florea, builds a smaller open-air comb, often in a bush or low tree, and the cavity-nesting species, Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, and Apis cerana, the eastern honeybee, are the ones that build the enclosed hives we've been describing. There are also stingless bees, bees of the tribe Meliponini, that are social and build hives, but in a quite different way. Stingless bees are found in tropical regions around the world. They don't use beeswax as the primary building material in the same way as Apis bees. Instead, they use a mixture of wax, propolis, plant resins, and sometimes mud and soil. Their hive structures can be quite elaborate: tubes, spirals, chambers, with specific functions, and each species has its own architectural style. The study of stingless beehive architecture is its own fascinating field. A hive full of honey is a valuable resource, and many animals would like to access it. Bears, skunks, mice, wax moths, wasps, small hive beetles. Each of these presents a different kind of challenge, and the bees have evolved different responses to each. Against large mammals, like bears, the primary defense is the sting and the pheromone cascade that recruits many bees to defend together. A bear attacking a hive may receive hundreds of stings. This is painful enough that many bears learn to avoid bee colonies, though some persistent bears are not deterred. Against wasps, which can raid hive stores and kill bees, the defense is partly physical. Guard bees, wrestling with and evicting wasps at the entrance, and sometimes balling a wasp, surrounding it with many bees, and vibrating their bodies until the wasp dies from overheating. Against wax moths, which lay their eggs in the comb and whose larvae can destroy combs as they tunnel through. The defense is vigilance, guards and patrol bees, removing moth eggs and evicting adult moths when detected. Against small hive beetles, a fascinating defense has been documented. Bees will chase a small hive beetle through the hive, herding it into a corner. The beetle is too tough and too flat to kill easily, so the bees do something remarkable. They seal the beetle in a propolis prison. They build propolis walls around the trapped beetle, encasing it alive. They can't kill it, but they can immobilize it. And they do. Some bee species have even more dramatic defenses. The Asian honeybee, Apis cerana, has evolved a specific defense against the Japanese giant hornet, one of the honeybee's most dangerous predators. When a scout hornet finds the hive and lands to mark it with scent for other hornets, the bees respond with a heat ball. Hundreds of bees swarm the hornet and pile on top of her in a dense ball. They vibrate their flight muscles rapidly, generating heat. The temperature inside the bee ball rises to about 46 degrees Celsius. This temperature is lethal to the hornet, but just barely survivable for the bees. The hornet dies. The bees disperse. This defense is highly specific. It works against the giant hornet, partly because the hornet has a slightly lower heat tolerance than the bees themselves, a narrow margin, but enough. The western honeybee, which did not co-evolve with the Japanese giant hornet, has no effective defense against it. When giant hornets attack hives of western honeybees, the hornets can devastate the colony. This is one reason why the spread of giant hornets into new areas is of serious concern to beekeepers and conservationists. Honey has been valued by humans for as long as we have any record of human activity. Cave paintings in Spain, dated to perhaps 8 to 12,000 years ago, show what appears to be a human figure collecting honey from a wild bee nest. The painting shows the figure reaching into a hole in a cliff with bees around it and a container beneath. Ancient Egyptian texts mention honey extensively. It was used as medicine, as sweetener, as a preservative, and as an offering to the gods. For most of human history, obtaining honey meant finding and raiding wild nests. This was not comfortable work. Beekeepers in ancient civilizations developed ways of keeping bees in pots or straw baskets or hollowed logs. The earliest forms of managed hives, hive-keeping, has been practiced in Egypt for at least 4,000 years. Based on archaeological evidence, the modern movable frame hive, as we mentioned, dates to the mid-19th century. Lorenzo Langstroth patented his design in 1852. This design, with frames that could be removed, inspected, and replaced without destroying the comb, allowed beekeeping to become far more manageable and productive. But even before Langstroth, people had been watching bees with great curiosity and writing about them. Aristotle wrote about bees in his Historia Animalium around 350 BCE, noting their organized society and their honey-making. He was wrong about some things. He thought the lead bee was male, a king, but much of his observation was remarkably accurate for someone working without a microscope, without chemistry, without modern biology. Jan Swammerdam, a Dutch naturalist working in the 17th century, was one of the first to correctly identify the lead bee as a female, the queen. He worked with early microscopes to examine bee anatomy in extraordinary detail. And then, in the 20th century, Carl von Frisch cracked the code of the waggle dance, a Nobel Prize-winning discovery that emerged from years of careful, patient observation, watching bees in glass-sided observation hives, training them to come to food sources, tracking their dances, and correlating them with the location of the food. The study of bees has been, in a quiet way, one of the longest-running scientific investigations in human history, from cave painters to ancient philosophers to Renaissance naturalists to Nobel laureates. Humans have been watching these small creatures and slowly piecing together the remarkable reality of their lives. We've talked a lot about the hive in activity. Let's talk about the hive at night. As the light fades and the temperature drops, the foragers stop flying. One by one, the field bees return. The entrance traffic slows. The guards are still at their posts, but there is less to guard against. Inside, the hive does not go quiet. There are bees moving across the comb. There are bees working on the wax. There are nurse bees tending the brood. The queen may still be moving through the colony, though she too rests. At times, some bees do something that looks very much like sleep. Bees enter a state of reduced activity in which they are less responsive to stimuli. Their antennae drop, their body temperature may fall slightly, and they remain in one spot for extended periods. This state bears enough resemblance to sleep that researchers have called it sleep and have studied whether bees experience something like the sleep that other animals experience. The research suggests that sleep is important for bees' learning and memory consolidation, much as sleep is important for those functions. In other animals, including humans, bees that are sleep-deprived perform worse on certain tasks that require them to use information they've learned. A sleeping bee might be found clinging to the edge of the comb, or nestled in an empty cell, or simply standing, motionless, on the surface of the frame, antennae drooping, in an observation hive, at night, lit by red light that the bees cannot detect. You can see these resting bees scattered throughout the colony. Some bees are still moving, still working, but others are still quiet, somewhere between waking and sleep. The hive at night is something of a reduced hum, not silent, never silent, as long as the colony is alive and warm, but gentler, a softer version of the daytime activity. The honey sits in its sealed cells, patient and sweet. The brood develops in its sealed cells, patient and growing. The queen rests somewhere among her daughters, and the hive breathes slowly, waiting for morning. We've talked about behavior and architecture and communication. Let's spend a little time on the bee's body itself, because it is a remarkable piece of biological engineering. A worker honeybee weighs about 90 to 100 milligrams. She is about 15 millimeters long. She has 6 legs for wings, and a body divided into 3 parts: head, thorax, and abdomen. The head contains most of the sensory equipment, 2 large compound eyes, which together give the bee a wide field of vision, 3 simple eyes, ocelli, on top of the head, which may help the bee detect light levels and maintain orientation, 2 antennae, which carry thousands of chemical receptors, the bee's nose, as well as mechanical receptors that detect vibration and touch. The mouth parts are adapted for both chewing and licking. The mandibles, the side-biting jaws, are used for manipulating wax, packing pollen, defending the hive, and handling food. The proboscis is the long, tube-like tongue used for drinking nectar and water. The thorax contains the flight muscles. These are enormous, relative to the bee's body size. They take up most of the thorax. They produce the power for both wing movement and the heat-generating vibrations we've talked about. The wings, 2 on each side, connected by tiny hooks called hamuli, into a single functional surface during flight, beat at 200 times per second. The 6 legs are each specialized tools. The 4 legs have special structures for cleaning the antennae. The hind legs have the pollen baskets. The middle legs help transfer pollen from the body to the baskets. The abdomen contains the wax glands, the honey stomach, the digestive system, the reproductive organs in the queen, the stinger, and the various glands that produce pheromones. It is a compact and remarkably functional package. The bee's exoskeleton, the hard outer shell, is covered in branched hairs that are electrically charged and excellent at collecting pollen. This charging is partly static. The bee builds up an electric charge as she flies through the air, and this charge helps pollen jump from the flower to her body. The compound eyes of the bee perceive a range of light that extends into the ultraviolet. Ultraviolet vision allows bees to see patterns on flowers that are invisible to us. It also allows them to navigate using the polarized patterns of skylight. The bee's color vision is shifted relative to ours. They see ultraviolet, blue, and green well, and they don't see red as a distinct color from black. A purely red flower is not particularly attractive to honeybees, but many red flowers also reflect ultraviolet light, which bees can see, and many red flowers are pollinated primarily by birds, which do see red well. A beehive has a very particular smell. If you've ever been near a hive in summer, not a frantic defensive hive, just a calm, well-kept hive being gently inspected, you may know the smell. It is warm. It is sweet, from the honey and the nectar being processed. It has an undertone of wax, slightly waxy, slightly earthy. There's a floral quality, from the propolis and the pollen, each carrying the sense of the flowers they came from. Beekeepers often describe this smell as one of the most comforting smells they know. It becomes associated, over years of keeping bees, with peace and warmth and the satisfaction of tending something alive. The smell is also information. For the bees, different areas of the hive smell differently. The brood area has one scent profile. The honey storage area has another. The queen moves through the colony, trailing her pheromone signature. A new bee learns the smell of her colony and uses it as a reference point. For her whole life, a bee placed in a foreign hive will be detected partly by her smell. She smells wrong, different from the colony members, and will be rejected. Beekeepers sometimes help introduce a foreign queen to a colony by letting her be slowly familiarized to the colony's scent before releasing her from her introduction cage. The smell of healthy bees is quite different from the smell of sick ones. Certain diseases, American foul brood, a bacterial infection of the larvae, produce a characteristic foul smell. Like rotting, experienced beekeepers can sometimes diagnose problems by smell before they can see them. Smell pervades the life of the hive. It is one of their primary channels of communication, one of their primary ways of knowing the world. If we could somehow perceive the chemical landscape of a hive the way bees do, we would see a world of invisible patterns and gradients, constantly shifting, filled with meaning. We are only beginning to understand. The hive is not without its vulnerabilities. Honeybee colonies face a range of pathogens and parasites. Some are ancient, some are more recent. All of them are part of the context in which the bee's remarkable behaviors evolved. Varroa destructor is perhaps the most significant threat to managed honeybee colonies today. Varroa is a parasitic mite, a tiny, reddish-brown creature, visible to the naked eye as a small speck, that feeds on the fat body of developing and adult bees. Varroa originated in Asia, on Apis cerana, and jumped to western honeybees, Apis mellifera, sometime in the 20th century. As beekeeping spread bee populations around the world, the western honeybee has had far less time to evolve defenses against Varroa than the eastern honeybee has. Varroa reproduces inside sealed brood cells. A female mite enters a brood cell just before it's sealed, hides under the food supply, and waits. Once the cell is sealed, she lays eggs. The mite offspring mate inside the cell, and when the adult bee emerges, one or more reproductive female mites emerge with her, ready to enter new cells. Varroa doesn't just feed on bees. It also transmits viruses, most importantly deformed wing virus, which causes bees to emerge with stunted, crumpled wings and severely shortened lifespans. A heavily mite-infested colony can decline rapidly and collapse. Managing Varroa is one of the central challenges of modern beekeeping. Beekeepers use various treatments, organic acids like oxalic acid, or other approved treatments, to reduce mite populations. Some bee populations have developed behavioral traits that reduce mite reproduction, such as uncapping and removing infested brood cells, or grooming mites from each other. American foul brood is a bacterial disease caused by Pinobacillus larvae. It infects bee larvae and kills them, producing the foul smell we mentioned. It forms very long-lasting spores that can persist in hive materials. For decades, it is serious enough that in many jurisdictions, beekeepers are legally required to report it and burn infected hives. European foul brood is a different bacterial disease, less severe than American foul brood in most cases, and generally treatable or manageable through colony management. Then there are the small hive beetles, wax moths, nosema, a fungal infection of the digestive system, and various viral diseases. Each presents its own challenges. A healthy, strong colony with a robust population of young bees and good hygienic behavior, is the best defense against most of these threats. The bee's own behavioral repertoire, removing dead larvae, sealing intruders with propolis, maintaining temperature, is a significant part of their disease resistance. Modern beekeeping is, at its best, a kind of gentle partnership. The beekeeper provides a home, a hive box with removable frames, that is suitable for the bees. She maintains the hive, checking it regularly for health, managing pests, ensuring the colony has enough food, and harvesting some of the honey surplus when conditions allow. In return, the bees do what they do. They build comb, they raise brood, they gather food, they make honey. A hive inspection begins with smoke. The beekeeper uses a smoker, a small metal device that burns natural fuels, like wood chips, pine needles, or burlap, to produce cool, white smoke. She puffs smoke at the hive entrance, and under the cover, before opening it, smoke does several things. It triggers a feeding response in the bees. A smoke signal in the wild often meant fire, and fire might mean the colony has to move. So the bees respond by eating honey in preparation for leaving. A bee full of honey is physically less able to sting. Her body is too distended to curve properly. Smoke also masks alarm pheromones, interrupting the chemical cascade that leads to defensive behavior. With smoke, a skilled beekeeper can open and inspect a hive of 50,000 bees with very few stings. It requires slow, deliberate movements, no sudden jerks, handling the frames gently, not crushing bees, moving with the kind of calm attention that, over time, most beekeepers find genuinely meditative. Beekeepers look for several things. During an inspection, they look for the queen, or for signs of a queen, like eggs and young larvae. Seeing an egg in a cell tells the beekeeper that a queen was laying in that cell less than 3 days ago. They look for healthy brood. The larvae should look pearly white and curled in a C shape. Discolored, sunken, or perforated cappings can indicate disease. They assess the honey stores. Are they adequate for the season? Is the bees' population growing or declining? They check for signs of swarming, queen cells in preparation, perhaps a population growing too large for the available space. And they just look at the bees moving across the comb, at the structure the bees have made, at the small world inside the box. Many beekeepers describe this looking as its own reward. There is something about the combination of attention and calm required to work with bees that quiets the mind in the way few other activities can. Let's return to honey, because honey is what most people associate with bees, and it deserves a slow, careful look. Honey begins as nectar. Nectar is a sugary liquid produced by flowers in structures called nectaries. It's primarily sucrose, the same sugar you might put in your tea, dissolved in water, along with various minor components. Depending on the plant, a forager bee drinks nectar, using her proboscis, and stores it in her honey stomach. The crop is not the same as her digestive stomach. It's a separate chamber, designed specifically for carrying liquid. In the crop, the nectar begins to change. Enzymes secreted by glands in the bee's head are added to the nectar. Invertase is the most important of these. It breaks the sucrose molecule into two simpler sugars, glucose and fructose. This is the first step in turning nectar into honey. When the forager returns to the hive, she passes the nectar to a receiver bee through trophallaxis. The receiver holds the nectar in her own crop for a while, working it, adding more enzymes, then passes it to another bee. This process of passing, working, and repassing may happen multiple times. Eventually, the partially processed nectar is deposited in a cell. It's spread thinly across the cell walls, maximizing its surface area. Bees fan their wings over the cells, creating airflow. That evaporates water from the nectar over hours and days. The nectar thickens. Its water content drops from perhaps 70 or 80% down to 17 or 18%. At this point, the honey is stable at low moisture levels. Microorganisms cannot grow in it easily because of both the low water activity and the slight acidity of honey. When a cell is full of finished honey, the bees cap it with a thin layer of beeswax, and there it sits, available to the colony when food is scarce, in winter, or during a period with no flowers blooming. A productive hive might make and store 60 or more pounds of honey. In a good season, a colony needs perhaps 30 to 60 pounds. To survive the winter, in a cold climate, beekeepers harvest the surplus, the honey beyond what the colony needs. The flavor of honey varies enormously, depending on its floral source. The honey made from clover nectar is mild and sweet. Buckwheat honey is dark and strongly flavored. Orange blossom honey has a distinctive floral fragrance. Manuka honey, from the Manuka tree in New Zealand, is so strongly flavored and so high in certain antimicrobial compounds that it is used medicinally. In some applications, a jar of honey is a concentrated record of the flowers that bloomed. In a place, during a season, each jar is unique to its location and its time. There is a quality to the hive that has always attracted mathematicians and people who love pattern. The hexagonal lattice of the comb is a tessellation, a tiling, and tessellations have fascinated people since ancient times. Floors, windows, decorative arts, textiles, human cultures around the world have independently discovered the aesthetic appeal of tiling patterns, including hexagonal ones. But the mathematics of the hive goes deeper than the shape of the cells. Consider the number of bees. A colony of 50,000 bees, each making many decisions each day, produces a collective outcome that no individual bee could plan or understand. The colony as a whole generates behavior that is far more complex than the behavior of any individual. This is scale, applied to simple rules, producing complexity. It's a kind of arithmetic that doesn't feel like arithmetic. It feels almost like magic until you understand the mechanisms. Consider the efficiency of the comb. The hexagonal honeycomb is optimal in the sense we described. It encloses maximum area with minimum perimeter, but the bees also optimize in other ways. The walls of the cells are built to a thickness of about 0.073 millimeters, thin enough to conserve wax, but thick enough to be structurally sound. The cells are tilted at 13 degrees, the minimum angle that prevents honey from draining out. These numbers were not chosen by the bees through deliberate optimization. They emerged from millions of years of selection, but the result is as close to mathematically optimal as biology tends to get. Consider the waggle dance. The bee encodes direction as an angle relative to gravity. She encodes distance as a duration. These are linear transformations, mathematical operations, and other bees decode the dance, perform their own inverse transformation, and fly to the indicated location. The bee is doing something that in human terms would require coordinate geometry. The mathematical elegance of the hive is not the result of any individual bee's intelligence. It is the result of billions of bee generations of selection, each one incrementally favoring whatever made the colony slightly more successful. The elegance is deep time's gift. We've talked about the smell of the hive. Let's talk about its sound. The sound of a beehive is primarily a hum, the combined sound of thousands of wings moving, thousands of bodies vibrating, produces a continuous, low drone. This sound is often described as soothing, as white noise, as something that grounds the listener. Many people who work with bees report that the sound of the hive is one of the most calming sounds they know. But within the general hum of the hive, there are more specific sounds. Bees communicate through vibration as well as chemistry. They transmit vibrations through the comb itself, through the material of the hive, in a form of communication called substrate-borne vibration. One of the most studied of these vibrational signals is the tooting and quacking of virgin queens. When a new queen is about to emerge from her cell, she produces a high-pitched sound called tooting. Other queens still in their cells respond with a different sound, called quacking. This sound can be heard by humans listening to the hive. The tooting and quacking communicates the presence of multiple queens, a situation that, in a hive, must be resolved. Two queens cannot coexist peacefully. The first to emerge will typically try to sting and kill her sisters still in their cells, with the worker bees guarding the remaining queen cells, depending on whether the colony intends to swarm again. There is also the stop signal, a vibrational communication used to interrupt waggle dances. If a worker bee headbutts a dancing bee and produces this brief buzz signal, the dancing bee stops her dance. Stop signals are used in various contexts, including when a forager has encountered danger at the advertised location, or when the receiver of a stop signal shifts her behavior in response to current conditions. Bees also make a specific sound when queenless, a different quality of hum than a queen-right colony. Experienced beekeepers can sometimes hear this difference before they confirm the colony's status visually. It's a sound described as more anxious, higher-pitched, more urgent, though projecting emotion onto bees requires care. The difference is real and reliably detectable. Let's spend more time with the winter cluster, because it's one of the more remarkable things a bee colony does. When temperatures drop below about 14 degrees Celsius, about 57 degrees Fahrenheit, the bees stop foraging. Below about 10 degrees, they form the cluster. The cluster is tight, thousands of bees pressed together, bodies touching. The outer layer of bees forms a dense shell, their bodies oriented with heads inward and abdomens outward, serving as living insulation. Inside the cluster, the bees vibrate their thoracic muscles, the same mechanism as shivering, to generate heat. The center of the cluster is kept relatively warm. The outer bees are cooler, but not dangerously cold. The cluster is not stationary. As the bees consume the honey nearest to them, they move slowly through the hive, toward their remaining stores. They move as a unit, never breaking the cluster in cold weather, because to do so would mean the bees on the periphery could become fatally chilled. Sometimes, if the honey stores are placed in a location that the cluster cannot easily reach, if there's a gap in the frames between the cluster and the honey, for example, the colony can starve surrounded by food. They cannot break apart to reach it, without risking fatal chilling. This is one of the reasons beekeepers pay careful attention to hive configuration before winter. In a mild winter, the cluster consumes less honey. In a harsh winter, more. A colony might enter winter with 60 pounds of honey and emerge in spring with 30, or a colony might starve in January. If the winter is long and cold, and the stores were insufficient, spring is an anxious time for beekeepers. Before the flowers bloom, before there is food for the bees to collect, the colony is living on its remaining stores. If the queen begins laying in late winter, as she does, responding to increasing day length before the cold is truly over, there are larvae to feed, which accelerates the consumption of stores. A colony coming out of winter too hungry and too small may not survive to see the flowers. This is called spring starvation, and it is not uncommon. But when a colony does emerge from winter healthy and strong, when the first warm days bring the first foragers out, and they find the first flowers of spring, there is something in that moment that beekeepers often describe as a kind of relief and a kind of joy. The colony made it through. Another year is beginning. It seems right, as this long and gentle story comes toward its end, to say a word about the future. Bees face challenges that they didn't face 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. Not just the parasites and diseases we mentioned, though those are serious, but broader challenges. The loss of habitat, as land is converted to intensive agriculture, to development, to monoculture, the diversity of flowers available to bees declines. Bees are generalists. They can use many different flowers, but they need a diversity of flowers across the season to meet their nutritional needs. Pesticide exposure. Some pesticides, particularly a class called neonicotinoids, have been shown to have sublethal effects on bees, impairing their navigation, their learning, their reproductive success, at concentrations that don't kill them outright, but weaken them. Climate change. The timing of flowering is shifting as temperatures change. If the bees' flight season and the flowers' bloom season fall out of sync, both suffer. And yet, bees are remarkably resilient. They have been on this planet for longer than humans have. They have survived ice ages and mass extinctions. They evolved alongside catastrophic changes in the world and adapted. People are working hard to help them. Beekeepers managing their colonies carefully, scientists developing better disease treatments, and studying bee genetics, farmers and gardeners planting pollinator-friendly flowers, cities and communities creating urban habitats for bees and other pollinators. And there is something else worth saying quietly. Paying attention helps. Simply being aware of bees, knowing something about their lives, their complexity, their ancient relationship with the flowers, and with us, is not nothing. Understanding the world we live in, even a little more, even a small sliver more, is a kind of care. You are now one of the people who knows a little about how bees build their hives, how they swarm, and scout, and dance, and build, how they make wax from their bodies, and honey from flowers, and how they keep each other warm through winter. That knowledge connects you, gently, to a world that has been humming along long before humans arrived, and that we hope will continue long after. There's a thought worth sitting with. As we come to the end of this night's exploration, a single bee, on her own, is a small thing. She lives for weeks. She builds one tiny piece of comb, or carries a few milligrams of nectar, or guards the entrance for an afternoon. Individually, she is almost nothing, a flicker of life, brief and small, but as part of the colony, she is part of something that can live for years. Something that can build structures of extraordinary precision and beauty. Something that can survive winters. That would kill any individual bee in hours. There is something in this that is worth holding lightly in your mind. As you fall asleep, that many small things, working together, without any one of them understanding the whole, can add up to something that none of them could achieve alone. That complexity can emerge from simplicity. That beauty can emerge from function, that the sum can be incomparably greater than the parts. This is true of bees. It is true of many things in the living world. And if you let it, it's a thought that can make the world feel a little more extraordinary than it did before, a little more worth paying attention to, a little more worthy of quiet wonder. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight. We began in a hollow tree, with a swarm of bees just arriving at their new home. We followed the scouts as they danced their information to the rest of the colony. We watched the first flakes of wax appear on the abdomens of the young bees. We traced the slow building of comb, cell by cell, hexagon by hexagon, through the long weeks of summer. We spent time with the nurse bees, and the foragers, and the guard bees at the entrance. We traced the transformation of nectar into honey. We followed a bee as she navigated by the sun, and as she returned home carrying pollen on her legs. We thought about the queens and how they're made, about propolis and its chemistry, about the precise temperature of 35 degrees in the brood, about the winter cluster, and the long, patient darkness. We thought about the mathematics of hexagons, and the physics of warm wax, and the ancient partnership between flowers and bees. We thought about Thomas Seeley watching swarms in the forest, and Carl von Frisch watching dances in his observation hive, and the cave painters in Spain reaching for honey on a rock wall, many thousands of years ago. All of that was about bees, but in another way, it was about attention about the quiet rewards of looking carefully at something small and finding there is more inside it than you could have imagined. The natural world is full of these depths. Every organism, examined carefully enough, turns out to be more complex and more interesting than a casual glance would suggest. The bees are simply a particularly good example because their complexity is so well documented and so beautifully accessible. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. No information to remember. No task to complete. You can let the bees settle back into their hive. You can let the comb go quiet. You can let the temperature hold steady at 35 degrees. The honey sit in its capped cells. The winter cluster breathe gently in the dark. Everything is tended to. Everything is in its place. If you're still awake, that's all right. Let these images move through your mind slowly. A hollow tree in a forest. Somewhere in a warm valley. Inside, in the dark, the hive is breathing. The combs hang parallel, like slow pages in a book. The honey is amber gold in the cells. Pollen in quiet colors, yellow, orange, cream, violet, packed into cells near the brood. In the center, the brood, small lives sealed in wax, developing in warmth, patient and unhurried. Bees move gently over the surface of the comb. Their small feet, their touching antennae, the faint smell of wax and honey and flowers from 1,000 different places. Somewhere deep in the cluster, the queen rests. Her daughters move around her. The air is warm. Outside, it is night. The flowers are closed. The fields are still. The moon, if there is one, moves through the sky the way bees track the sun, using light as a compass, navigating time and space by the patterns of the heavens. A bee near the entrance is fanning, though there is little left to fan, just the habit of tending, the quiet work of maintenance. Somewhere in the comb, a young bee is cleaning a cell, thorough and careful, polishing the walls smooth. She has never done anything else. She will do this for a few more days, and then she will feed the young, and then she will make wax, and then she will guard, and then she will fly out into the open air for the first time. But that is in the future. Tonight, she cleans. The hive holds its temperature, 35 degrees. Always 35 degrees where the brood sleeps. The bees have been holding this temperature for millions of years. Before humans walked the earth, before the first stone tools, before language, 35 degrees in the dark, patient and constant. Let that number settle into your body like warmth. 35. Steady. Held. Maintained by 10,000 small lives working together without knowing they're working together. You don't need to hold anything right now. You don't need to think anything or remember anything. You can let your body be warm and still. Let your breath be slow. Let the weight of your limbs press gently into whatever surface is beneath you. The bees are tending things. They have always been tending things, long before tonight, and long into the future that you will wake to. Somewhere in a field, in a garden, in a forest, the bees are flying from flower to flower, carrying the weight of a tiny gold drop of nectar, bringing it home. Sleep now, if you're ready, or let the hive hold you a little longer. Either way, you're in good company.